Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. We appreciate everybody's patience this week as Mother Nature tried to stop us.
Yeah, she brought basically a hurricane into Nebraska where I live. We just got power back on after almost a week, so we are back and ready to record.
As a little gift to you all, because of our little break, longer than normal, we decided we're going to post our Patreon exclusive episode, which is Bonnie Parker, as in Bonnie and Clyde, you might be more familiar with. We're going to post that for everybody to hear. And then we'll go back to our regular programming on Monday with what will be part 2 of today's story. So little extra content for your patience. We really appreciate the listens, the follows, the reviews, the ratings, all of that. As we said, we love to talk history, and all of that makes us very happy. And at the end of today's episode, make sure you stay on because we do have another listener response. This one coming from our normally history disliking mother. She actually decided to do one for Elvis, which was super exciting.
Oh my goodness, yeah. This is very rare and exclusive.
Right. She said, we are not allowed to promote it anywhere. So you will not see any promotion of her listener piece. And she is like, I hate my voice. And I said, that's everybody.
Yeah, welcome to the club.
Yeah. I didn't want to tell her, well, wait till a bunch of people tell you online that they hate your voice.
I think I win I have the most annoying voice ever. So, I mean, bravo.
As an Olympic category, then.
Yeah, I won gold.
Our YouTube comments section is, not that I'm yelling at you, YouTube listeners. I know 99% of you are wonderful human beings, but we're like, okay, I'm going to hide in my little hole for a little bit or never speak again. Let me just write on paper only. But we don't care. We're going to go and march forward with our history stories because that's who we are. And annoying voices and all.
I can't change it, sorry. There's not an option.
I know, I'm always like, well, thanks, but that's my voice. Not much I can do about it, I'm sorry. I do apologize that you hate it so much. But I appreciate that you let me know because, like I said, there's
literally nothing you can do. So
right.
You're stuck with my vocal fry voice. I'm sorry, guys. I know. I wish I had an English accent as well, but
you could try.
No, I'm sure that would make it better.
When I tried to read Bluey books to my daughter, I tried to bring in the Australian accent, and it gets pretty bad. It starts turning, I don't know, British, then it's like Southern, and
Irish a little bit probably.
I'm like, she's though not even 3, so she
doesn't know.
She can't write mean comments online.
To her, you're like an Oscar winner. She's like, oh, and Mom, she's nailing it.
Just like watching Bluey. Yeah, exactly. Well, Erin, I'm going to let you take the stage today because I know this is a topic and a family that you are very familiar with. And of course, you got me to watch clips from Wolf Hall.
Yes, that's the whole point of the episode. So we could just wrap it up right now.
I know. I texted my boyfriend because a joke between us is always about Erin's obsession with Wolf Hall. And I had bought him a copy of it. And anytime that there's a holiday, we gift each other the copy of
back and forth. This makes me sad because one of you should actually read it. It's really good. I can't believe that you're trading a really great
now it's
book.
Now it's an inside joke, but I told him, sorry, this is going to be explicit language here. But I said when I clicked on the first link and I saw Mark Rylance's face come up, I was like, you motherfucker. I was like, I didn't know that was her whole tactic.
You knew.
I should have known. I know. I was like, she got me. She got me good.
To be fair, I was looking for other Tudor content, and there wasn't a lot of great ones out on YouTube available. But
not ones with Mark Rylance.
No. If you guys have not caught on we're doing our first Tudor person. The Tudors were, I think, our gateway drug into history.
Oh,
back in the
100%.
day. Mhm.
David Starkey and that Six Wives of Henry VIII. While we're on vacation in beautiful San Diego, let's just stay in our cramped hotel room with four children.
Yep. Watch a PBS documentary with David Starkey. Then the Showtime show, The Tudors, also came out. We were prime age, like I think it must have been 2006, 2007.
Something like that. But that was much more, that was our sexy introduction into, or sexy continuation. I don't know. But I just remember, though, with the first one when we were like in 6th grade, like I said, for those youngins out there, this was the day before you got like tracking numbers or anything like that. None of those two-day delivery. So I just remember sitting outside, and every time the mail truck would come by each day, being like, "Is today the day we're going to get our box set?"
Yeah.
Of probably VHSs, would it be? Or was it DVDs at that point?
I think it was DVDs. We're not that old. I mean, we
are old.
We're old, but not quite. We lived in the golden age between
a box set, a box set DVDs. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, the person that we're going to be talking about today, which you'll already know because you clicked on this episode and it has her name, it's Jane Boleyn. She might be someone you recognize from either the Tudors, the other Boleyn girl. She's in any Tudor drama, Wolf Hall, obviously. But you might not know her whole story. So I wanted to put her on trial this week.
I'm somebody who would consider myself pretty well versed in the Tudor universe, but it's been a while since I've read anything.
And we'll talk about some of the, as you mentioned, I gave you some clips, but I think I really wanted to do this one too because she's really gone through an overhaul in terms of her reputation. So historians have started to reevaluate her in the past decade, 2 decades or so, including the book that I read for this, which was Julia Fox's Jane Boleyn, The True Story of the Infamous Lady Rochford. So that old narrative around her is changing, and she's someone who's been vilified by, again, the TV programs, fictional novels like Wolf Hall or Philippa Gregory books. If you've seen a Tudor drama, you've seen her usually lurking in the shadows like a viper waiting for her chance to strike. And today we bring her into the spotlight. So
even just my, like, as I said, I don't like to do too much research before. We like this to be kind of more of a raw first listening. So I don't want to be too informed on the person, unless, of course, I already know more about them. We like to have kind of those first reactions because that's where you get those great moments, like when the church man getting his head sawed off by a bread knife. What? That was completely shocking to me. We like to keep it that way, but it seemed like everything I read online, was very much her being this, like you said, lurking in the shadows, this kind of conniving, like, oh, I'm going to use this to basically, well, no, I don't want to go into it, but for her own gain, which.
Exactly. I don't think I already said it, or if not, she's married to Anne Boleyn's brother, George Boleyn. So that's how she factors into the Tudors of it all. So I gave you some homework, as we mentioned. You got to watch a few clips, including the one, the only Wolf Hall, which is my favorite, to see some recent depictions of Jane in the media. It had probably been a while since you've watched anything in terms of Tudor media. Thank you, listeners, again, for letting me bully Jamie into watching some Wolf Hall.
Disclaimer, I have watched Wolf Hall. I just don't watch it constantly. It's not my go-to, like, relaxing show like Aaron. Mine is Normal People, which is so much more light and happy.
Jamie, so do you want to tell the listeners how would you sum up the clips? How would you say that Jane is usually depicted in these Tudor dramas.
She's definitely depicted as like, I would say, like uptight. You can tell there's tension, obviously, between her and Anne Boleyn. I mean, Anne makes
she slaps her.
yeah, she does that too. But before that, she makes a comment about her age. There's definitely a antagonistic relationship there between the sister-in-laws, and then even just her facial expressions, you can tell, is seen as somebody who's, I don't want to say, and again, maybe it's because I have that background with the conniving, but that she's like,
which she's seen as very like deeply unhappy. Yes. She's not a fan of the Boleyns, including her husband.
Right, which is in the last clip. But then in the second clip, you see her with your man telling about, basically saying how she can give glimpses, essentially be a spy in places that the other like advisors.
Well, the men of court can't.
Exactly.
They're not allowed into women's spaces.
Right. So they have to the advisors and important people in Henry VIII's circle. She's offering herself up as, I am allowed into these chambers. I'm part of this. I can give you information that nobody else can. Then on the last clip is where you see her being very, very miserable on her wedding day, not wanting to do it. I'm assuming it's her dad.
Yeah, it's her dad who's sort of pulling her down the aisle.
Yeah, basically like, they're a good family. You're going to do this. And
that one's from the Tudors. And I'm sure you remember from the Tudors that her and George are very unhappy. It's pretty abusive in terms of the relationship. And then same with Wolf Hall.
Yeah, the part you see of George, he's laughing about it. And then again, Daddy, I think Daddy Boleyn kind of like slaps him on the back of the head and is like, take this seriously.
Yeah.
Not a great start to the marriage.
No, that basically sums it up in terms of what you think of in terms of Jane Boleyn. Yeah, very deeply unhappy. She's usually shown as jealous of Anne Boleyn and George's relationship, since they are very close siblings.
Yeah.
I think she's fascinating, enigmatic in the way that very mysterious to access women of that far in the past. And she makes all kinds of decisions that, we could spend an entire podcast trying to explain the reasons behind.
Yeah. I'm very curious, as I said, somebody who's not as familiar with her. I'm familiar with her more, again, in the story with like the action, but not more of her backstory and such, and less in the later years. But it will be interesting to see and talk about, why she made the decisions that she did, which, is it because of opportunity? Is it because that's her option, one of her few options? I'm very excited to kind of hear that piece.
Yeah, that's why I really wanted to dive into her background too, because I know of her life at court, but not too much else. Let's start from the beginning. Before she was Jane Boleyn, she's Jane Parker. Her father, we saw as we mentioned in the Tudors clip, he's Sir Henry Parker, or Lord Morley. He's a landed peer, so she's lucky to have lands titles in her family. If you're going to be born in early modern England as a woman, not a bad family. Yeah, not a bad family to be born into. Just a little bit of background about her family. Her father was part of Margaret Beaufort's household. So Margaret we've talked about her on here before, but just as a reminder, she's the mother of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. So that would make her Henry VIII's grandma. Margaret was a powerhouse in her son's court, and she essentially put him on the throne. She had a very lively household and was basically the queen in everything but name. She cared deeply about education. So Jane's father, when he was in her household, he got a really great education. And throughout Jane's life, her father was always known as a good scholar. He was a man who loved learning. He was a scholar, not a fighter. So a man after my own heart.
I know, love that.
Yeah, and her parents' marriage had been made by Margaret Beaufort. Her mother came from very good stock as well. They were really well matched, and the couple would have 5 children. So there's Jane, she has 2 sisters and 2 sons. They had 3 daughters and 2 sons.
Mm-hmm.
So we won't really get into them because they don't really play a role. But so she's part of a decently sized family, and she was born in 1505.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense, yeah, that she would be, I don't want to say gifted an advantageous marriage, but because of her titles and such and connection, I'm assuming all the kids are going to be marrying into well-to-do families.
Yeah, the landed gentry. So they might not marry the bluest of bloods, but have really good matches.
Right.
We don't know too much about her childhood because we've talked about this many times, that the people who wrote histories and things could give a fuck about women's childhoods or childhood in general. We don't know too much about that, but we know that she would have been given a decent education with who her father was. Not on the level of, say, later Princess Mary or the future Queen Elizabeth I, but probably decent.
The basics, at least.
Yeah, and her parents were courtiers, so she would have been taught the things like how to embroider. And courtly things, music, that kind of thing. And like I said, since they were courtiers, they'd be away at court and back at the households. So Jane wouldn't have seen her parents a whole lot, and that's what she would expect to do when she grew up. But yeah, I wish I could tell you more about her childhood, but that's kind of all we know about her youth.
Unless that people have a very specific childhood into royalty.
Yeah, like Elizabeth I or even Lady Jane Grey. We know more about her education and her youth because she was exceptional in terms of her learning. If you're not exceptional, they're not going to write about you. That's kind of all we have in terms of her youth. This is going to be a theme because Jane's going to be in the middle of all this excitement in terms of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn later, but it's really going to be hard to get to her actual feelings and thoughts. So just keep that in mind.
Right. I'm assuming we don't have a lot of physical evidence.
Yeah, you're just kind of piecing together
based on her actions.
Yeah, exactly.
When does she come into the picture of history, like where we start seeing her recorded?
Good. That's perfect. We do the first recorded reference is when she goes to court. So she enters court life herself. She becomes a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon, somewhere around 1519, 1520. And again, you can't get much better than that in terms of prospects for a woman. So who was Catherine of Aragon, the queen that Jane was serving? I just want to give a little bit of background for those people who might not know. They didn't spend their San Diego vacation watching David Starkey. Not everybody did, but she was Henry VIII's first wife. By the time Jane started to serve, Henry VIII and Catherine had been married for quite a long time. They were married in 1509. As any Tudor girlie would know, Catherine was an impeccable Renaissance queen. She was learned, religious. She was a great ambassador for
Catholic,
Aragon. Very Catholic. Yeah. The only blemish on her record in terms of her queenship was she had difficulty bearing children. And FYI, trigger warning, I will be talking about pregnancy loss. So if that bothers you, I just want to give you a warning here. Catherine had suffered numerous miscarriages, stillbirths. She had one son who lived about a month before dying. And then around the end of her childbearing years, which came around 1518, which was right around the time Jane came to court, she only had Princess Mary left. Princess Mary was the only one who survived. To put it in context, because, we always talk about Henry and needing a son. The reason he needed a son was there had been no ruling queens in England's history, so no queen regnants. Empress Matilda had attempted to secure the throne centuries earlier with no luck. She's actually the one who the House of the Dragon is loosely based on, minus the dragons.
Come on, we can't have any dragons, even in early history.
No. Well, the Tudors are from Wales, and their flag has a dragon, so there's your dragon. You get one.
I'm fine without like the familial, or I guess just incest. It implies familial. I'm fine without that, but give me some dragons.
Sorry,
if our mom is listening, which she probably will, because she loves us, she'd be like,
"You dragons."
Wasn't that her reaction to when we were explaining Game of Thrones?
Yeah, don't worry, Mom, no dragons. So that's kind of the queen that Jane would be serving and the world that she was entering.
If I was a queen, I'd be like, I'm only getting old ladies, the oldest of ladies.
I don't think Catherine didn't quite catch on.
I'm sure they also didn't really have a choice, because that was like a position for, basically well-to-do women.
You had to. I think I told Matt, my husband, that if I was them, I'd be like, you're going to wear highlighter yellow. Nobody looks good in that.
When I was telling Eric this weekend at one of our dinner, I was like, just old ladies.
The most matronly, ugliest dresses. But what was court life like for someone like Jane? She'd have her own servants. She's a lady in waiting, but she's not going to be dressing herself. Come on.
That's too hard.
Yeah. They're there to support the queen. They, play games with her. They go do mass with her. They're there to run errands for whatever the queen needs. Like, not groceries, but, running messages and stuff. Yeah. So they're there for DoorDash. Basically, whatever the queen wants, that's what you're there for. Court was constantly on the move. You're moving from one palace to the next. And as lady in waiting, you would go along with. And Jane was lucky to be one of those who got to experience the field of the cloth of gold.
What is that?
Wait, I will tell you. I can't believe you, as a Tudor person, I can't believe you don't remember this. This was a great event organized by Cardinal Wolsey, who basically ran Henry VIII's government for him. Well, the king got to enjoy the perks of being a young, hot king. Kids these days, they never want to work. So Cardinal Wolsey, event planner extraordinaire. It was a meeting between Henry VIII and his French counterpart, King Francis I.
Now I know. Yeah.
They were going to make peace as sexy and cool as war. They went all out in terms of this. It was the event of the time. You can look up, you could Google images of it. Lots of gold, as the name would suggest. Cardinal Wolsey spared no expense. Jane's father was there too. So her father was there. Same with her future father-in-law.
Her dad wasn't impeding on her fun, was he? Like, Dad, give me some spit.
He was probably getting up to his own shit because there were 2 fountains full of wine just flowing.
And maybe he was drunk. I don't need my dad at the party of the century.
Everybody who was anybody. So yeah, we've got Thomas Boleyn was there too. Mary and Anne Boleyn, Jane's future sister-in-laws, were there. We don't know if George, her future husband, was there, but it's most likely that he was there with his dad. And I can't imagine how awe-inspiring this would have been for Jane. It's like getting to attend the biggest event of probably the the century, or at least like the decade or decade. It's like attending the Olympics or a Taylor Swift Eras tour.
Yeah, in like the VIP section.
Yeah, there was 6,000 men and women on each side. That just kind of gives you the scale of it. Jane even got a kiss from Francis I.
Oh.
Yeah, he kissed all of Catherine's ladies, except for the ones he thought too old or too ugly. I know, I'm like, never change, man. Never change. Even as a king, you can't suck it up and kiss all of them. How embarrassing. I can't remember the numbers, but it said like, I think there was only like 3 or something he didn't. And I'd be like,
it's like, nah, keep going.
Everybody, Google a picture of King Francis the First of France. He should not be the arbiter of looks.
That's the problem, though. It's the kings, I think, because they have that power, they're like, oh, I'm a hotshot. I can decide that. That's what I'd tell myself if I was one of the 3. I'd be like, that's okay.
Well, he was laden with syphilis.
I don't want that mouth anywhere. Don't want that mouth anywhere.
It was in 1524 that talks began for Jane's marriage.
Jane's father decided on a family near to the Parkers, a family he must have known at court, one that had Henry VIII's good graces, for now, and a single son. Drum roll, please.
George.
Yes, the Boleyns.
Of course, at the time that these discussions were happening, the Boleyns were just one of many influential court families. No one could have known that they would steal the spotlight in just a few years.
This was a good marriage for Jane. We don't have an exact birth date for George, but we know they would have been approximately the same age. Really good for a aristocratic woman not marrying somebody who's 30, 40 years older than you.
Are they going to get married early or before some of the, like before the end?
They're going to get married basically right before all of the Anne Boleyn stuff kicks off. Jane really does come in right at the beginning and has a front row seat to the many events of Anne and Henry courtship, their marriage, and obviously the downfall. They drew up the prenup agreement on October 4th, 1524. The reason I mention that is because we're going to go into the details later when it concerns us. We want to get to the action, though. We were not going to talk about the prenup now. We don't know the exact date when they got married, but it would have been sometime between November 1524 and early 1525. So again, that would make Jane and George probably around 1920. So not super, super young, but in terms of the ones that we've talked about.
So is the one from the Tudors, like, do we know anything about her wedding day then? So or is that's just projected based on later their relationship?
I was going to talk a little bit about early life, and then I was going to talk about how she felt about George.
Yeah.
But let's just dive right in since you're mentioning it. So how did Jane actually feel about George? You know, that's a big question. You mentioned the clip from the Tudors that I showed you. In Wolf Hall, she's shown as hating her husband, and her husband hates her. She hates and resents Anne, and she basically wants out of the marriage. We'll talk about all those narratives around that later, but off the top of my head, I can't think of a single representation that strays from that.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about already in previous episodes about, obviously, marriages are contracted not for love at this time. The reason that they were married was because they are both good court families and they lived close by, which is good for accumulating your property portfolio. Love was very rare,
Right.
which is why Henry loving Anne and trying to marry her because of love is remarked upon. A lot of the evidence that explains Jane's ill feelings towards George are problematic. The first one we'll talk about is the fact that they never had any children. Obviously, we're in a much, much different place nowadays to talk about fertility and fertility struggles. So the fact that they didn't have any children shouldn't be read as a barometer of them
not necessarily having sex.
We know that there could be so many different reasons. And we would not know if they had miscarriages or anything. You know, Jane's not the queen. That's not going to be remarked upon. So we wouldn't know that.
Right. Especially if it was early ones or, anyone's. It's, who's nobody's recording that in any official capacity.
Mm-hmm. And we do know that, spoiler alert, when George is imprisoned later, Jane does write to him and she's concerned about his well-being. I think that at least that shows some concern even when he's in prison.
Can I ask a question since you've already hinted at him being imprisoned?
Yeah.
How long had they been married at that point?
It would have been, so they were married in 1524. He's imprisoned in 1536.
Okay, so they had been married a decent lot. Yeah, I'm just curious if it was in the first 5 years or 10 years.
No, they had been married a solid decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I talked about the letter. So I think that's the best we can do in recovering the relationship, which I know is scant at best. But what I can say is there's no real evidence that we have that she hated her husband. There are theories put out, and in the Tudors, you'll see George being portrayed as bisexual or gay. Again, no real evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the Tudors implied that George had a relationship with the court musician Mark Smeaton, who will come up later. They got that from a historian, Retha Warnock, who put forth that theory. But the only evidence that we have of that is that George gave a copy of a satire book on marriage to Mark later on.
Romantic.
I've given books to many a person, and that doesn't mean that we're in a romantic relationship.
Mm-hmm. To be fair, Eric bought me a book this weekend, so
yeah. And I did give a book to my now husband when we started dating. But that's but that's just the small, small piece. But yeah, in terms of reconstructing Jane and George's relationship, we can assume it was a working relationship, like 99% of marriages of their status at the time. She'd be used to spending time away from him when he was at court, or, it's just, there's no actual evidence of her hating her husband.
Right.
So we'll put that out there right now.
So our default can just be like, it was a marriage.
Fine.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Just like, hey, when we see each other, we're cordial. And again, we don't have any evidence in the bedroom. Like with the Tudors, we can't assume or say things about his sexuality just based on the fact they don't have kids. We don't know anything, whether they've been sex or not having sex. Or
like people can speculate, but if you're looking for the evidence, that's what we've got.
So that's good to know.
Yeah. What did the newlyweds do after their marriage? They're young, probably pretty attractive, rich. The world was their oyster. There are plenty of places they could stay at. The Boleyns owned a lot of properties. There's Hever Castle, Blickling. But these young folks, their fortunes lie at court. So, and they were in close proximity to both the king and the queen. George was in the privy chamber, so he'd be at King Henry's service. You'd cycle between time at court with Henry, and then you'd go to your estates, and then you'd be on again. Mm-hmm. Just like what we said, what Jane and what her parents did. Yeah, and what George's parents were doing as courtier families. This is before Anne Boleyn is in the picture. Their star was on the rise, even without Anne Boleyn.
The big piece.
Yeah, people always forget this, but Thomas Boleyn had been working as a diplomat, and he was really well respected at the court, and he was also a jousting partner of Henry VIII.
Yeah.
he was made Viscount Rochford and had already been a Knight of the Garter, which we talked about during, that would have been John of Gaunt, I believe, because that was, Knight of the Garter was what Edward III created. So he was living it up. These are prime appointments, and he was not getting because of Anne Boleyn at this point.
Sure.
And
There's becoming a more and more prominent family.
yeah, and George was following in his father's footsteps. It looked like he would sort of fill that diplomat role as well. And they were all like, all the Boleyns were intelligent and could be put to really good use at court.
Right.
So she would have been prepared to have a good life before all of this stuff with Anne Boleyn came about. But of course, her life and that of her husband's family would be far from usual because the times they were a-changin'. Now we're going to get into the Anne Boleyn of it all. By the mid-1520s, where we're at, Henry's queen and Jane's mistress, Catherine of Aragon, is middle-aged. Henry did the time-honored thing and started to look for other options around. Is it comforting that men have been the same since at least the 1500s? Well, even before that, we talked about Edward III and Philippa.
I was so mad. Waiting till the deathbed. If you're gonna do it, just do it. Do it early. Don't wait till I'm.
Is it better that Henry already has rock bottom expectations? So you're like, of course he did.
Yeah, but he had mistresses before, right? Like Mary Boleyn.
Yeah, I was just about to say that he had already had one illegitimate son with one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies in waiting, Bessie Blount. And sometime around the Field of the Cloth of Gold, which we already talked about, he had become involved with Mary Boleyn, who is, yes, George and Anne's sister. The dates are really murky.
Yeah.
Henry never flaunted his mistresses, so it was really hard to tell when it started and when it stopped.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it was an exceptionally long-lived affair. Mary Boleyn's husband, because she was married at the time, he did get gifts as compensation, as they usually do.
So nice. Thank you.
In a lot of these cases, people think that it's good to be the king's mistress and it's good for those families, but Henry actually was not the most generous with his mistresses. Like Bessie Blount, she gets a good marriage, but she's not married to a duke or anything.
Sure. Henry, do better. You're going to have mistresses at least. Give them some nice stuff.
Like other kings definitely gave their mistresses a lot more.
Give me money, jewelry. A good marriage.
In fact, after the Mary Boleyn affair died off, Cardinal Wolsey he was overhauling the Privy Chamber, and George Boleyn, Jane's husband, unfortunately didn't make the cut. So he wasn't being able to access the king on a daily basis. He just became one of the king's cupbearers, which sucks, but don't feel too bad for him because he got a pay raise.
Oh.
Yeah.
Was the cut by Wolsey a direct, I don't want to say slap, but a direct hit on the Boleyns?
We don't know. That's what it speculates. Was he trying to curb the power of the Boleyns because Thomas was also very high up? We don't know. It's possible because the Wolsey, we know Wolsey and the Boleyns did not get along. We won't go too much into that, but they have a fractured relationship, we should say. So I wouldn't put it past Cardinal Wolsey. We'll say that.
No, and even if you're not talking to somebody about it, and you don't know all the politics, what you can know is it's like powerful people in the court are either going to be aligned with you or against you. Especially if you're somebody who is part of a rising family, it's like, okay, I'm either going to partner with you and we're going to rise together, or I'm intimidated by you.
Yeah, and Mary Boleyn's husband was also in the Privy Chamber. He didn't get cut. So Maybe it was like, well, we don't want two
Mhm.
essentially Boleyns in there. I think that we could put it that way. But as I said, don't feel too bad for them. You got to pay raise an extra 20 pounds a year. And they were given rooms in Henry's side of the palace.
Oh, nice.
I mean, as a young couple, they were doing really well. There'd
Yeah.
be plenty of money for new dresses, luxuries of every kind. But if Jane thought things could not get any better for her and her husband, let's introduce Jane's sister-in-law, the one, the only, everybody's favorite gal, Anne Boleyn. Much can be said and has been said about Anne Boleyn. Yeah,
where to even start.
This is where we could literally do an entire season of episodes on Anne Boleyn. And, I'm not wearing it now, but our older sister gave me a shirt for Christmas that says, always willing to talk about Anne Boleyn. So pray for me as I try to keep this short and sweet. There's a lot of moving events in these next couple years, and I would love to dive into every one of it. But I'm going to try to keep this Jane focus. But we do.
I know. At one point, I was like, "Oh, should we do Anne?" Like that would be a beast of an episode.
That's the thing, is I'm going to try to keep it focused, but we do need to meet the players, and sometimes we just have to talk about it because, again, Jane's there. She's there every step of the way.
Right, and that's part of how she rises and falls. It would be the same as if I was when I was doing Alexandra and not mentioning Nicholas or any of that context. Like, you have to. The only reason you were even talking about her is because of Anne.
Yeah, we would hardly know her name. She'd be one of, so many court ladies who we might see their name in
lost to history. Yeah.
So let's dive into Miss Anne Boleyn. Anne, we know, was sent away from her family home at a relatively young age to serve queens, first in France, and then he was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, again, he's a diplomat. He must have worked his magic. People say he must have been like the smoothest talker in the world to get his daughter at these glittering courts. These were arguably even better than England. So
he's the thought, it's not like I'm sending you away because I'm mad. It's like I'm trying to bring you up so when you return, you're even.
Yeah, and that's basically what Jane Parker, or Jane Boleyn now, she did. She was sent to Catherine of Aragon. It's to cultivate your skills, to meet other people, your network. It's to network and to find marriages.
I'm curious, though, why France, with England and France being so at odd.
Well, first she was sent with Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary, who was marrying into France. She was only queen for a matter of months before her husband died. But when she went back, Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, Anne, stayed and served the next queen, Queen Claude, who was Francis I's wife. She stays, and again, this is where she learns how to be Anne here. When she returns to England around 1522, she's cultured, she's witty, she's just ready to take the court by storm.
I picture a 90s movie, like the door opens and she comes in and everybody's like, hey.
Oh my God. Is that Anne Boleyn?
She went from like a quote, like ugly duckling. She's like Anne Hathaway with her glasses and frizzy hair, and then suddenly
she removed her glasses and suddenly she's hot. Although, to be fair, we will say that Anne was not the most attractive person. That was not her appeal. Her appeal was wit, and she just knew how to wrap men around her little finger.
Same girl.
We wish. I know. But she just had that, like, je ne sais quoi, where men wanted to, like, be with her and women wanted to be
not
her.
Same girl. I don't got that. I don't got that.
Definitely not about looks.
Just one of those people who's just has that energy. It's that energy they bring, and you can't teach that.
Yeah. And we don't know when Anne and Henry became involved exactly, or more like when Henry decided he wanted Anne and all the ways a married man wants another woman. We won't go into the details because, again, Jane focused. Going to keep focused on Jane. But with Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress, Henry decided, maybe I do want another wife. As Anne and Henry tried to determine what to do next, Anne's family was right next to her. Her sister-in-law, Jane included. This whole family must have waited anxiously on May 17th, 1527, when Cardinal Wolsey opens the first inquiry into Henry VIII's marriage with Catherine of Aragon. For context, for people who don't know why he was doing this,
Yeah.
or at least the reason he was giving for this, was that Catherine had been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, for a matter of months before Arthur died. Henry and Wolsey had their perfect get out of marriage free card right there.
Yeah, the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Suddenly they had gotten dispensations for it, but never mattered. Doesn't matter. Jane and the Boleyns had to lay low, though, because it would look bad if it looked like he was trying to get out of the marriage to marry her. They were trying to keep it above board and be like, oh, my heart feels a little guilty, and I feel like I need to make sure that I'm not breaking biblical law.
Right. They don't want to look like they're also part of this, trying to take more power. Like, yep, we want to be the family of the next queen.
Exactly. If Jane and her Boleyn in-laws thought the marriage question would be wrapped up quickly, they were mistaken. The case would have to go to the Pope. And I just want to explain this because I think there is this misconception around this. There would have been no reason for Anne, Henry, and the Boleyns to anticipate that the Pope would have any issue granting Henry as an annulment. Popes of the past, they dispensed annulments like candy to kings. That was not the issue. The issue was that Catherine of Aragon had a nephew who was now King of Spain, and he was on the march in Italy, where the Pope lives.
Yep. I always love that. It's like, yeah, it becomes this bigger story.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're going to embarrass my family? Not on my watch. The Pope was in a lose-lose situation. The King of England was pissed off at him, but he was not going to upset Catherine of Aragon's nephew, who was literally in his backyard and then eventually does take Rome.
Right. Like, and to see the Pope being like, no, stop.
Like, this is not what I was expecting when I signed up for this.
Yeah. Thought I just got a lot of money and positions and probably,
a mistress or two.
Right.
Typically. But if you thought that the Boleyns were going to sit by and just wait, that's not their vibe. That's not what the Boleyns do. Jane's husband, George, went to France with his father to convince the French to support the annulment.
Yeah.
Nothing like another superpower to put a little bit of pressure on the Pope. I can't imagine that it would have been easy for Jane, too, sitting and waiting. You have to think at this time, Jane is she's still serving Catherine of Aragon, as is Anne Boleyn. So that would be like the most awkward situation. I can't even imagine. Like, I'm getting nervous and tense right now just thinking about it.
I know. I want to call out of work. I'm like, I don't feel good today. I can't be lady in waiting.
Yeah, it would be the most awkward situation. And you got to feel for Jane because she knew Catherine. She had served her. There's a chance that she really did love her.
Right.
But also loved her sister-in-law. But because she's a Boleyn, she's got to be Team Anne.
Yeah.
She rises and falls with the family. That's her lot in life is tied with them.
Right. By marriage. I cannot imagine that. And just trying to pretend that none of it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's new? Not much.
If this gamble paid off, and it would be
Right.
amazing for the Boleyns. That means she would have a sister-in-law as Queen of England,
Yeah.
which is something that, again, she could have never imagined when she married George.
No, it's a big promotion.
Yeah, it was a really big promotion. 1528 almost brought the end to the whole hope of Anne's marriage to the king. The sweating sickness, which is this mysterious disease. I don't think we even know what exactly it was, but it keeps recurring through the 16th century. It strikes England in 1528. The Boleyns themselves were not immune from it. Jane and George, they were at court with Henry and Anne at Greenwich when the disease hit, which is, again, proof that these couples got along and they were always there.
Double dating.
Yep. Keep in mind that Henry's still married. George is like, me and my wife and you and your mistress.
Yep. Fun.
Henry, he's such a germaphobe and he was always so scared of disease. He just hightailed it out of there. He bolts like the coward that he is. The Boleyns, they retreat to Kent, where most of their property was, including Hever Castle, when one of Anne's maids was struck with the disease.
Uh-oh.
Jane's husband, George, also got really sick. I think he was the first one in the family to get sick with it. We don't know if Jane was with him, but it seems pretty likely. She didn't get it, so she at least didn't fall ill. But the sweating sickness did not stop there. Anne Boleyn herself got really ill, enough where Henry VIII sent his sweetheart, his second best doctor.
Oh, perfect.
Like,
lovely.
Oh, honey, thank you. So sweet. He has to keep his number one for his number one, aka himself.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't blame him about being a germaphobe at this time. I mean, when you know that, especially, his brother dying young.
Yeah.
Just knowing how diseases just sweep through places, I'd be like, fuck this, I'm out of here.
His brother probably did die of sweating sickness too. To be fair, he only has Princess Mary as his heir. I love that you're sticking up for Henry.
No, I'm just saying, I'd be like, hell no. But as his lady, I'd be like, thank you. What about me? So I'm not letting him off the hook. I understand him being a germaphobe, but ditching your supposed love.
She got really sick. I mean, it really did look like she was going to die, but luckily, as we all know, she recovers. Their sister Mary's husband, William Carey, though, was not so lucky.
R.I.P.
Yeah, R.I.P. Like, well, it could have been much worse for the Boleyn fortune. Sorry, William Carey, baby, I don't know you, but you're expendable. You're expendable in the history and for the story.
The Boleyns are like, oh God, thank God it was just William.
Actually, what this reminds me of is when, oh my God, this is so 90s, this is so millennial. When the Spice Girls, when we heard that Ginger Spice was leaving the group, and all of the girls, we all had, your designated Spice Girl, and all of us were like, oh, thank God. And then our friend who was Ginger Spice was like, damn it.
Yeah, that was mine. Yeah, because we were all with bated breath, figuring out.
Please not my Spice Girl.
Spice Girl. No.
That was Baby Spice.
That was Sporty Spice. Harper has a leopard print jumpsuit, basically.
Oh, does she? Oh my God! Can you get her a wig and have her be Scary Spice for Halloween?
That would be really funny.
Then you could dress up. You could dress up as one too.
Okay.
Please.
Okay.
Can't
just have two Spice Girls. I need other people to join me.
Okay.
If you come up and be a Spice Girl and get Matt on board, and Matt can be Baby Spice.
You don't have to ask me twice to dress up as a Spice Girl.
I'm not sure what I want to be. I guess Ginger, because I have the red hair. There we go. Like one of those big platforms.
I'll be Posh. How about that?
Yeah. I want the big platforms. Now that I'm in ugly shoes.
All right. So back to even as the court case for the divorce between Henry and Catherine drags on, Jane still gets to reap the benefits. Jane and George had a rented house at Greenwich for them, paid for by the king.
Nice.
And George becomes a squire of the body. In November of 1528, George and Jane receive the honor of the keepership of Beaulieu Castle, which is one of Henry's lush palaces. It's not a gift of the castle, but it's more like you can stay in it whenever you want.
Ooh.
You essentially have your own castle, even if you're not royalty yourself.
Right. You don't own it, but it's like, hey, whenever you want.
It's also near Jane's family home, so it would have been an added bonus. So you could go home, see mom and dad, but then go home and stay in your own castle. Yeah,
I
not bad.
like that. I'd take that.
Yeah, Jane even received her own New Year's gifts from the king, so not just with George. So that shows the bond between all four of them is pretty good. And so they were living in luxury.
Yeah.
And then when George becomes knighted as Viscount Rochford, Jane becomes his Viscountess, which is very Bridgerton.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was like, that's like my frame of reference.
Yeah. I remember when you were young, I was like, Viscount. And I'm like,
I know.
It's Viscount, baby.
I know. I feel like that's one of the only ways that I can remember myself is because of Bridgerton.
Yeah.
Like, nope, that's a Viscount, babe. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jane would have been one of the most important ladies at court. They also received this lucrative wardship, and she sponsored a scholar named William Foster, which is what grand ladies do. And I'm like, not what I would be spending my money on, but you do you, girl.
Like, here, little boy, you don't have money. Now go to school.
I think he was in college.
Oh, well, that's what I mean. Like, little boy.
Here's some lunch money. There you go.
I'll pay for your school.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody paid for my college.
So not bad. Yeah. The scholar would later call her the most special patroness. So bravo.
Yeah. That's what I call Joe Biden for forgiving my student loans as a teacher. The most special patron, yeah.
Since Henry VIII would later had a list of all of George and Jane's belongings, everything that George after he died. We know a lot about what Jane owned as well. So we know some of the items included 10 pairs of sleeves for her gowns, 2 pairs of knives cloaked in black velvet, and a prayer book lined in silver. It's a little smattering, just a preview. Obviously, tons more.
Sure.
So, they were racking in the money and the wealth. As a Boleyn, Jane was there for all of Anne's triumphs. Jane was there alongside her Boleyn family when Anne accomplished the greatest coup and married Henry VIII. And she was there at Anne's really grand coronation. George actually was absent at the coronation. He was on one of his other diplomatic missions to shore up support for Anne and Henry's marriage. But we know that Jane wrote to him to give him all the details about the coronation. Jane's parents and her brother were at the coronation as well. So it was a very, very much a family affair. We can't access her feelings. We don't know how she felt, but I'm sure she felt relief that all this years of back and forth, not knowing what was going to happen, had all paid off. Now her sister-in-law was the Queen of England.
Right. I'm sure she was like, this is going to be smooth sailing from here on.
Yeah, absolutely. This would have been the peak of Boleyn power since Anne was pregnant during her coronation with the future Elizabeth I. Of course, they didn't know that, and they thought that she was pregnant with a son. So they all assumed that that long-awaited prince was on the way. Good times were ahead. Julia Fox, who wrote the book that referenced at the beginning, she indicated that this was probably one of the best periods of Jane's life. Her marriage was successful, and there's no reason to believe it was anything other than happy. That's a quote from there.
Even if, again, her and George weren't deeply in love, they're both doing really well so it's like, yeah, things are good.
Yeah, and Jane was a creature of the court. She had basically, lived her teenage years through it, and she would have been thriving. She had gone from being a bit player in the background, just one of the ladies, to the absolute center of power. Her sister-in-law is queen. Her husband is one of Henry's closest men, and he's also, obviously, as brother to the queen, a very close advisor of her.
Yeah, I mean, especially since Anne doesn't have sisters.
Well, she does. She has Mary.
Oh, sorry.
We'll come to that later.
I should say that Mary's not part of her.
Yeah.
Mary's not part of the court, right?
Well, Mary does get exiled for making a second marriage without the king's permission, and it's much lower. Jane is very much like the queen's sister, essentially. She's, at least in what we can tell. We'll see later what Jane and Anne get up to. We can see that it seems like Anne leaned on Jane more than she did her own sister.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We don't know if Jane was in the birthing chamber for Elizabeth I, but she probably was, as one of the ladies in waiting. They were there for those births. She had a job to do in addition to being family. Jane's loyalty to Anne Boleyn would actually put her in the crosshairs of Henry VIII, though. This is cue Jaws theme. Henry, as Henry was wont to do, had begun looking outside of his marriage and checking out his options, especially among Anne's ladies. We hate him. We don't know who the object of his affection was, but it was enough to elicit notice from people, including Ambassador Chapuis, who was there representing the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
And he loved himself a hot goss moment. He was all into the hot gossip. So he's the one who writes this story. Oh, he's Anna. Oh my God, him and Anna from the Alexandra episode. They would have gotten along so well. Oh my God.
Besties.
A lot of the information about Anne's time we get from his dispatches. Anyway, Anne sees her husband looking at some other lady, and she's understandably not happy with that.
Yeah.
She asks Henry to send the woman away, whoever she was. And what do you think Henry did?
He did not do that.
Yeah, hell no. Gets angry. When that doesn't work, Jane becomes involved. Jane and Anne decided that Jane would essentially pick a fight with this woman, enough to cause enough drama so that Henry would be over it, and he'd be like, I don't want any drama, and he would send Anne's rival packing.
Ooh.
I kind of do love the scheme.
Girl power, yeah.
But the plan actually backfired because instead of sending the rival away, Jane was actually exiled from court around October 1534.
Yikes.
It's a pretty big deal to exile the queen's sister-in-law. I wish we had more about this. I think this is where you can tell that Anne and Jane must have been close enough where Anne would enlist her sister-in-law in a scheme to get out that other lady in waiting. We don't know how Jane felt about it afterwards. It would be really embarrassing.
The woman who had been part of the court first exiled from it like that.
At least we know that Anne turned to her. She had, again, Mary Boleyn was there, and she also had other friends. There are other people she could have enlisted. I do think, even though we don't get the reasonings behind it, I do think we can read a little bit into that. We also know that, considering some actions later in Jane's life, Jane was not above getting involved in schemes like this. I wish we could talk more on it, but it is a very interesting thing where we see Anne and Jane directly working with each other. Yeah. It would have been not until early 1535 that Jane made her way back to court after that humiliating episode. Again, we don't know how Jane felt about the fallout, but you could see a case where she's upset at Anne that she was the one who had been punished.
Yeah, there's obviously a whole lot of different options that could be going through her head, but I could definitely see as somebody who obviously is not queen, but who has a decent amount of power and, like I said, has grown up being in the court, and how embarrassing to be exiled. And when you come back,
everybody would know. She hadn't been involved in anything like that before, or at least that we know. So
it's hard to know because at the same time, I would assume she would understand that Anne doesn't have
the full power.
Right. Like she can't just go to Henry and be like, no, you can't do that. Because that's why the scheme is even being a scheme in the first place. So it's like, well, would she really blame her?
Or just blame Henry?
Yeah, or she's just angry in general, and it's just easier to put her anger towards Anne.
Now we're arriving at the downfall of both Queen Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn in the spring of 1536. This is one of the most complex events of the time. And again, I'm not going into a play-by-play, except for to emphasize what we know about Jane's involvement. So I'm just going to put that out there. There's actually a really good book by Natalie Griniger, who hosts the Talking Tudors podcast. She has a book about the final year of Anne Boleyn. Actually, I think it's like the last year and a half. So if you wanted like beat by beat, I would look into something like that.
Yeah, I was trying to give Eric like this weekend a like little snapshot of
it's so hard
of like the charges, and he was like, "What? Like, was that?" I'm like, okay,
yeah. So if you watch the Tudors, Wolf Hall, the other Boleyn girl, this is where you're like, okay, I know the story. Henry VIII, he's sick of Anne. He's angry at her for not giving him a son.
Like she promised him.
And Anne's also wanting to be involved in the government. She's trying to be involved in the dissolution of the monasteries. And he does not want a queen to be doing that. He wants a traditional consort. Henry wants a new wife, ideally Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour.
See? Ladies in waiting.
Yeah, who he had started making eyes at and flirting with, like a lovesick middle school boy. My gosh.
Gross.
Yeah. I do love in Wolf Hall where they do show the men at court, including the men who would be convicted of sleeping with Anne. They're talking about Henry doing all this sighing about Jane, like just like sighing and talking about how pretty her fingers are and other weird stuff, as making fun of them, which I mean, pretty fun. Yeah, it was good.
Unless you're flirting like a middle school boy with me and head over here. Not a middle school boy.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point.
But love sick like one.
And meanwhile, in the story, Jane Boleyn's supposed to be jealous of her husband George's relationship with his sister Anne. She thinks that they're too close, that he likes Anne, his sister, more than he likes her, that Jane hated her husband and her in-laws, and she wants a way to get rid of them. In this traditional story, Jane Boleyn is the one who runs to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's new fixer, administrator extraordinaire, who was more than happy to use the evidence to condemn Anne, George, and 4 other men as collateral damage. It's a story told over and over again. So what would you say if I told you that there's little, if any, evidence of Jane's involvement in both Anne and George's death?
I wouldn't be surprised because, as we know, it's not like she would have written in her a diary like, yes, I did this. I'm so happy that I got rid of my husband and Aunt. She wouldn't have done any of that. And in a story, especially one as sensational as Anne and the trials and stuff like that, you kind of want to build up who are the villains, and especially since spoiler alert, she survives this, you might be like, well, she must have done.
How did she survive?
Right. If her husband was accused of this and she was exiled earlier, like there must be some bigger
truth to it.
bigger piece.
There's no evidence that Jane gave evidence against George and Anne.
Nothing was used in a trial or anything.
Nope. So you have to think, what would Jane gain by eliminating both Anne and George, especially her own husband? Tudor wives, they're tied to their husband's fortunes. Our first figure that we did, John Dudley, his wife only recovered after his execution by marrying another prominent member of court.
Right.
Of course, people don't always act in our best interests, but we would have to ask why Jane would act against her own interest in getting George and Anne executed.
Right.
I do think those are the questions we have to ask.
Does she hate them both so much that, she would be willing to risk
her own prominence at court, her own money, which we will talk about?
Not necessarily, obviously, being penniless like her family, but it would mean who's ever left of the Boleyns, and she'll have the Boleyn name, are going to be not in good shape.
Yeah.
And who knows if she's the one who initiates this kind of witch hunt because she's a lady in waiting to, and she doesn't necessarily guarantee her own safety.
Yep. Yeah. So we do know in a court letter, we know that there are 3 ladies mentioned as giving something to accuse Anne of adultery. We have the Lady Countess Worcester, who was one of Anne's closest friends. Yeah. Nan Cobham, and it just says 1 lady more. So unnamed. You heard that right. Jane's not among them.
But she could be the unnamed one.
But wouldn't it seem likely if it was her? Why wouldn't you use her name? That would give it even more credence if it was
true.
Her sister-in-law.
Yeah.
So we do know, though, that Jane was questioned by the formidable and terrifying Thomas Cromwell. Not what any of us would want to do, except if it was Mark Rylance, then I would. There's foreplay, not actual questioning. Okay, just to let people know, I have a deep, deep love crush on Mark Rylance, especially Mark Rylance as Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah. And when he came and visited me in Minneapolis, and we asked the Uber driver, our friend Kelly and I were making fun of Aaron for being in love with Mark Rylance and saying all this stuff. And of course, our Uber driver wanted to be involved in this conversation. And so we showed him a picture. And
I think he almost crashed the car.
I think so. He was like, no.
Yeah. I think he almost got into a car crash. It was pretty amazing.
Not what he was expecting.
I can't help it. The heart wants what the heart wants.
Just like Henry VIII.
Yeah. Maybe I am coming around to this Henry VIII thing.
You're like, let me create my own church.
Okay. Well, this isn't to say, though, that Jane did not tell Thomas Cromwell anything. Julia Fox, in her book on Jane, does seem to think that Jane at least gave information about hearing from Anne that Henry was impotent, or at least had issues getting the wind in his sails, so to speak.
That would not go over well.
Yeah, Anne supposedly told Jane, and Jane repeated it to her husband. During George's trial, he's provided a piece of paper with words to that effect about Henry's impotence. You see this moment as it's played out in Wolf Hall, where George gets the piece of paper and he reads it aloud because he's playing to the court. He can't help himself. And then he says, "These aren't my words." And then Thomas Cromwell says, "Well, they are now." So you do see that moment. It is used as evidence that Anne knew that Henry couldn't get her pregnant, so she turned to others, including her brother, for help. So that's supposed to be, quote unquote, the evidence that Anne committed adultery and incest with her own brother to help her get pregnant.
Right. Because she, again, trigger warning for pregnancy loss. She had, besides Elizabeth, she had gotten pregnant multiple times.
I think at least 2 times. One of them, a lot of times, one of them's referred to as a miscarriage, but it's probably more likely a stillbirth. I think it was probably much later in term.
Yeah, wasn't that the one
yeah.
that supposedly was a boy?
Mm-hmm.
Or the story
Yeah.
goes, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's a huge leap based on one moment of Anne, which occasionally she would say things that she wasn't supposed to,
Right.
saying something to her sister-in-law about Henry not getting it up. That's a big leap to go from that to her basically admitting that she has to sleep with other men in order to get pregnant.
Right.
But in terms of evidence, even that's like pretty much all that we know, or we think that we know about what Jane gave to Cromwell. There's little that Jane could do for her sister-in-law or her husband, but that's not to say that she didn't try. I did mention earlier about that letter, so she did send a letter to George while he was in the Tower of London, and she asked him how he was doing and told him that she would humbly make suit unto the king's highness for him, so that she would go to the king, arguing, obviously, release him.
Do you think that she was being genuine, or I guess we have no reason to believe that
Yeah,
he wasn't?
I think we can take her at her word. I don't think there's any reason to think that she didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and George did send thanks back to her.
Okay.
With Thomas Boleyn, George and Anne's father, people always ask, what could he have done that he abandoned them and didn't do anything in their time of need? Well, whether it's Thomas Boleyn or Jane Boleyn, there was nothing anybody could do.
Right.
The king wanted and needed Anne and George dead. He knew that Anne would not go quietly, to quote Wolf Hall.
Right.
So in Wolf Hall, Thomas Cromwell says, so I have to push her because he knows she's not going to go quietly. Right. And he needed George because George was her supporter. He was part of the Boleyn faction. So
right.
We needed them both gone. Jane had little options but to try to petition for George's sake and wait and see what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. To quote Julia Fox again, Jane had become practiced in keeping her personal views private, like so many who surrounded the king. And the situation in which she found herself was not one in which it would be wise to break the habit of a lifetime.
Seriously. You gotta keep all of that to yourself.
Honestly, what could one lady in waiting somehow free Anne or George?
Right. No.
It's the same with Thomas Boleyn. He gets a very bad rap, but I find him a very tragic figure. He loses 2 kids in one fell swoop.
Right.
And Henry wanted him dead. There was nothing anybody could do about it.
Right. Once he had made that decision, it was done. Not like Henry Bell. Oh, okay. Well, then George can live.
Yeah.
Like any of those scenarios, Anne's going to be gone in any of them, and George is too much of a risk.
George would have fought tooth and nail for his sister. So
right.
He
exactly.
Knew that. Yeah.
Right.
Jane would not have been in the courtroom, but actually her father was among those who judge both Anne and George, which is weird.
Yeah. So he was like basically part of the jury.
Yeah, as one of the peers of the land. Yeah. However anybody felt about Anne's innocent. And to be clear, Anne is innocent. There's very little doubt. If you think Anne's guilty, then get out of here. Wrong podcast. Justice for Anne. Even the evidence that they gave, the dates and times that she was supposedly sleeping with these gentlemen one was right after she had given birth to Elizabeth, so she was not sleeping with anybody. Yeah. And then ones where they were saying she was at one palace when we know she was at another. At least the evidence was not correct. The accusations were for adultery, incest with George, her brother, and crucially wishing the king's death. That's the death sentences. No witnesses were called in either trial. Jane's name not mentioned as well. George and Anne both use every last bit of their wit and intelligence to defend themselves. Even people who were not supporters of them before noted how well they did. There was even some who really did think that George was going to be acquitted based on his performance in court. However, that was not to be. Anne and George Boleyn were sentenced to death alongside the musician Mark Smeaton, who we talked about earlier, in relation to George Boleyn. William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Henry Norris. They were all Anne's quote-unquote alleged lovers and all men of Henry's court. I think a lot of us know what happens next. So we've got the execution of Anne and George and the 4 other men. George's was on May 17, 1536, and Anne 2 days later. Jane would not have been there. I'm sure she would not have wanted to anyway. And again, very little she could do to spare George from his fate. No matter what she really felt personally about Anne and George, her current position was tied to being a Boleyn.
Yeah.
She had been there from the very beginning of Henry and Anne's courtship through to the end. And now she's in this purgatory. She's a widow of a condemned traitor to the crown. The Boleyn family is decimated. What now would she do with her life? Normally, a widow would hope for a remarriage to solidify her future. Her husband, who had just died, was literally accused of incest with his own sister, the Queen. And all that George and Jane had acquired over the years was now at the mercy of Henry VIII, which is not the man you want to depend on for mercy. In a lot of ways, this should have been the end of Jane's story right here. But somehow, unlikely as it was, she found her way back to court, to the very place that led to the loss of so many lives, her husband included. But first, she'd have to find a way to live. This is where we're going to leave off. In part 2, we'll chart Jane's unlikely return to court, the thought of her snitching to Thomas Cromwell, her time as lady in waiting to the next 3 of Henry's short-lived wives, and of course, the events that would lead to Jane's own execution years after her husband. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Erin. That was a really interesting part 1 to put things in context and helping even the non-Tudor fans understand, I think, kind of her trajectory and her being part of this family and their rise and fall.
Yeah, it's a decade of her life, and I know she doesn't do too much in this, but I think you can't cover her story without covering this piece, and you will see that I think it does play a big part of her next part, and she does become a very active player, especially in Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife. We've got to cover it all. I wanted to do as much as I could to make it understandable to people who don't know Anne Boleyn and Henry's story, but then also trying to keep focused on Jane.
Yeah, keep it condensed. At this part, before you tune out, we have our, as I said, listener response. Our mother, I'll just call her our mother, our podcast mother.
Pod mom, mom of the pod.
Good. She does not want to be promoted. So we'll keep her anonymous besides that. She sent a very nice listener response, even though she doesn't want to be promoted and she hates her voice.
We love it.
Hi, I'm Jamie and Erin's mom, and I can't believe I'm doing this, and this is way out of my comfort zone. But they asked me to do it, so here it goes. I'm going to give you some brief thoughts on the Elvis podcast. I really enjoyed the episode and was familiar with most of the topics they covered just growing up and reading a lot on Elvis, plus movies about him. I didn't grow up listening to a lot of Elvis music, as my parents played a lot of music, but not Elvis. So my experience with Elvis growing up was more with the Vegas Elvis, and I didn't really understand the appeal with all the jumpsuits and sequins and stuff. But as I got older, of course, I really enjoy his music and appreciate his accomplishments and what he gave to the music world and all of us who enjoy music. I don't think he was a villain, but certainly a very flawed individual in both his views on women, particularly motherhood and sexuality and his dependence on drugs or his addiction, and a need for that adulation from his fans. So I would put him at 70-30. I find it incredibly sad that someone with so much talent and potential was so failed by the adults in his life. First, his parents, or I'd say particularly his mother, who, with her close relationship, did him no favors. Of course, I'm making some assumptions here, but that she provided views on what a woman should be and what a woman in his life would look like, which was obviously somewhat problematic. Then, as he gets noticed and his career starts, he gets connected to the colonel who uses Elvis and takes advantage of him. Growing up in the manner that he did, being poor and his parents not familiar probably with how do you manage a star and money, I don't fault Elvis for not getting a lawyer and naively believing this guy was protecting him. And you have to speak to the doctors, which of course were adults who prescribed the insane amount of pills, certainly didn't have Elvis's welfare front and center. So yes, as a mom with daughters, I'm horrified of a 14-year-old starting a relationship with a famous singer who's 24 years old. There are things that say how that happened and what. I do not think Elvis stole the black music or intended to make money off of it. But that was his influence from his growing up years and where he grew up. So again, kind of at that 70-30, I certainly think that he was a very flawed person who was naive and would have been benefited from intensive therapy, but certainly a product of his environment. And he tried to do good and provide pleasure through his music and shows and his thought. I'm thinking he thought he was a good person by that. So that's my justification. Thank you.
Thank you, Pod Mom. We love you.
That was good. You just listened to me, plod my way through one of the most common events of modern history. So,
No. So, as we said, we will be back with a extra episode, exclusive. Normally it would be on Patreon, but we're releasing it to everybody since we had that lovely Mother Nature delay earlier in the week.
Bonnie Parker's episode will be released probably towards the evening on Saturday, and then we'll be back with the end of Jane's story, part 2, sometime on Monday is the plan, possibly Tuesday morning. Again, we're just trying to play catch up. If you're new to the podcast, we normally release our weekly episodes on either late Sunday or early Monday, but we've had a ton of 2-parters, 3-parters, and then this week we've been dealing with this episode in particular, some major editing issues and audio issues, so I apologize if any of that is really obnoxious. We've been having quite the time with it. So last few things to plug. If you want to send a listener response, you can send a recording, or if you want to just type it out, we can read it. It can be anonymous, can have your first name, however you want. On any of our figures we've done so far, doesn't have to be our most recent one. And you can email that to ambivalent.offenders.podcast@gmail.com. You can also email us if you have a suggestion for an upcoming potential offender. We love hearing ideas we can add to our ever-growing list. And also, please check out our Instagram. It is the best social media spot to check out, and just one of the best social media podcast places in general, thanks to Erin. Shout out to her. She's kind of our social media queen. We've got previews for upcoming episodes, so if you want to know who we are covering next, that's a great place to see. We also do kind of some funny twist. Erin had a funny one about Elvis in Middle America not being able to handle his hips. And then we also do some historical kind of short videos that give some information that we find really interesting connected to our topics that don't fit the narrative. So, for example, I talked about hemophilia and how we know
that Alexei Romanov did have hemophilia, as well as the discovery of the bones, the Anastasia myth, things like that that don't fit into the normal narrative. And if you want to support us or get extra content, we have Patreon. We get an extra episode exclusive to Patreon once a month, and also other bonus episodes, so shorter episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15, 20 minutes. You get those a few times a month, and that's for $3 a month. And there's also a $5 a month tier. If you just want to donate because you are feeling generous and you're enjoying the podcast, you can do buy me a coffee, buy us a coffee. I can't remember what it is. Something with coffee and buying. It's in our show notes. You can do a one-time donation for like $5 or something like that. That always helps with our hosting fees and our editing fees. Although right now, I wish it would be for somebody to edit our messed up audio. But as people who have jobs and me in education, this all just comes out of our fun budget. And so we appreciate any support, whether it's monetary or rating and reviews. That's another really appreciative thing that we hope you can do. So we will be back here shortly to tell you about Bonnie Parker's story and then the end of Jane's story. So we'll be judging with you soon. Thank you for listening, and we will be back shortly. Bye.